Hi, everybody, and welcome. My name is Rick Anderson. I'm the Associate Dean for Collections and Scholarly Communication in the library at the University of Utah. And at this time, I'm also serving as president of the Society for Scholarly Publishing. And I'm joined here by David Parker at Alexandria. David, I don't know your title. What's your title?
I am the head of video products distribution and licensing for Alexander Street.
For Alexander Street. All right, good.
Now a ProQuest company.
Right. Anyway, so we are here to talk to you about we're here to share our thoughts about possible futures for demand-driven acquisition. David asked me before I could ask him to open up the session. So we'll both talk for a few minutes, and then of course we'll invite conversation and discussion with you guys, and then we'll plan to end at 4:15. Sort of our overview question is one that actually, this is a question that occurred to me back in 1999. And I remember I actually wrote a column for Against the Grain on this question of, wait a minute, what if instead of trying to build and shape collections in libraries, what if we could actually offer our patrons access to absolutely everything and buy it for them as they express their need for it? And at the time, even I thought that was a crazy idea, and I couldn't see any possible mechanism for doing it. But it felt conceptually right to me. It felt more conceptually right to me than the idea of me as a librarian going out into the world of information and saying to my patrons, you wait over there, I'm going to pick out a bunch of stuff that I think you're going to be interested in and bring it back, and you can thank me when I'm done. Which is, of course, the traditional model of library collection building. Now, when I put it that way, it sounds very pejorative, and that's not fair. I mean, we as librarians have been building wonderful collections for hundreds of years. So the question for me isn't, can we continue to build good collections? We do a great job of building good collections. For me, the question is building collections the right way to give patrons access to the information they need in order to do their scholarly work? And I think that the answer to that question is a little more vexed. So our sort of context-setting question here is, what if libraries could offer their patrons every form of information, every document that they could possibly need that's currently available on one platform within a demand-driven model? And what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about three things that I think are pushing us in the direction of more and more DDA. And then David is going to talk about some of the factors that are inhibiting us from moving in that direction. And then we will be very interested to hear what thoughts you guys have. So the first of the factors that I believe is pushing us in the direction of DDA is the problem of continually tightening library budgets. Now, that may sound a little counterintuitive because, in a way, when you first encounter the concept of demand-driven acquisition, you think, well, wait a minute, you're putting the patron's felt needs in the driver's seat of acquisition. That like opens the floodgates to constant massive purchase of content, more than the library can afford. But a couple of things actually turn that assumption around. One of them is the fact that there is no DDA or PDA program out there that doesn't have built-in throttling mechanisms that are under the control of the librarian. So we tend not to make Harlequin romances part of our DDA profile, right? We all create a certain profile of content that we're making available. We're not actually showing them everything in the world that there is. So that's one important throttling mechanism. But the other thing that's been really interesting is that for many of us, and this isn't true of every DDA program, but generally speaking, I think if you ask a librarian who has experimented with DDA, has the overall impact been a net increase or a net decrease in acquisition? Interestingly, for many of us, it's been a net decrease. Our patrons are encountering a lot of books, they're poking around at them, but the ones that they're actually using at a level sufficient to trigger a purchase is relatively small. And again, your mileage will vary from place to place. And we did a DDA pilot with Springer ebooks that absolutely exploded on us and kind of caused a problem. But that was an outlier for us. So budget cuts actually move us in the direction of DDA. Budget cuts make us say to ourselves, how can I avoid buying something that I don't need to buy because I don't have any extra money? Of course, a budget doesn't have to be cut in order for us to be feeling that pressure. If our budgets are flat, and many of our library budgets are in fact flat, that means that our budgets are being constricted year to year at the rate of price increase. And I'll make my standard point about, I don't use the term journal inflation. Inflation is an impersonal macroeconomic force. I'm talking about price increases. So the prices go up every year. If our budget is flat, then our budget is constricted at that same rate every year. But it's not just a matter of price increase or budget cut. There's also the fact that publishing activity grows every year. So every year there's more and more stuff out there that we have the option of buying. And the more stuff there is, if our budget is flat, the more selective we have to be. And DDA is, in my mind, a fundamentally valid method of discrimination. Another thing that is propelling us in the direction of DDA is the continual growth in new DDA opportunities. So for many years, DDA was something that we thought of strictly in terms of books. But in recent years, opportunities to acquire journal content, articles, on a DDA basis have started to proliferate. One of the ones that I suspect most of us in this room are familiar with is ReadCube, which started out as a model that works specifically with nature journals. So the way it worked at my institution was we subscribed to some subset of nature journals, not all of them. What ReadCube gave us the opportunity to do was put all of the nature journal content in front of our patrons, and when they clicked on an article from a journal to which we did not subscribe, a little window popped up that said, do you want to just read this online for 24 hours? Do you want to have permanent online access to it? Or do you want to download a PDF? And it wouldn't say anything about the price differential. It wouldn't talk about the fact that the library is paying more for one of those options than the other. It just gave them those three options. The patron would pick the one that they want. The library would be charged for it. And we were charged really a fraction of the cost of buying an article through something like Get It Now or going direct to the publisher. And that has been a very successful model for us. I don't know how successful it's been for Nature, but it's been super successful for us. On balance, Nature, I think, ended up with a net increase in revenue from us because we were not going to subscribe to those other journals. We couldn't afford them. I mentioned Get It Now, which is, of course, one of the more quick and seamless article-level purchasing platforms that we use quite a bit in libraries. It tends to be more, article DDA tends to be somewhat more mediated than ebook DDA is. I'm not a big fan of mediation. I would prefer that my patrons just get straight into the content they need without having to hack through a bunch of branding or request processes or whatever. But frankly, mediation is one of the throttling mechanisms that keeps us from spending all of our budget in the first 3 weeks of the fiscal year. So it's a price we pay. And then there's the question of, or the also emerging platform or option of evidence-based package purchases. The difference between real DDA and evidence-based acquisition, of course, is evidence-based acquisition tends to operate at the package level. So a publisher might say, okay, we will make our entire ebook catalog available to your patron base. At the end of a period of time, we will show you usage data that indicates which subject areas were used more and less heavily, and you can decide which of those subject packages you want to purchase based on that data. It's not my favorite model because it still involves buying books that we don't demonstrably need. But it's not a terrible model, and it's one that has found some success in the library market. And then the third element that I want to talk about that is moving us in the direction of DDA is, frankly, the decreasing demand that we see for what I call the commodity collection. What I'm referring to as the commodity collection is the part of the library collection that consists of documents, books, articles, white papers, whatever they may be, that are easily available in a general marketplace. So, you know, a copy of East of Eden is a commodity book, whereas a handwritten diary in our special collections is not a commodity book. You can't just go out and buy a copy of that diary somewhere. The bread and butter of research library collections is commodity books. These are the books that we buy and put on the shelves and allow people to touch at will, as distinct from those that we put in the rare book vault and let people look at only under strict supervision. Our ebooks, our online journals are also part of the commodity collection. Now, the stuff that's online is still being used pretty heavily, but our printed commodity collection, and this is true generally speaking at least across ARL libraries. It's not true of every single library, but in the aggregate, we have been seeing for the last 15 or so years massive declines in the use of our printed book collection, and certainly our printed journal collections, which frankly are disappearing anyway. The exposure that we're seeing to the fact that a small and shrinking percentage of the commodity print materials that we buy are actually getting used, that alone is leading us to be both more selective in what we acquire in all formats, and also to try to think more strategically about the mechanisms that we use for selecting those things. And I wanted to point out here, whenever I say circulation is going down, the first thing that somebody usually says is, but your circulation doesn't measure in-house use, which is true, but at my institution, we do measure in-house use, and our reshelvings, which is the metric that we use for measuring in-house use, have gone down even more precipitously than our circulation has. The only way you could explain that away as something other than declining use would be to assert that somehow our patrons are reshelving their own books more and more every year over the last 15 years, and I somehow doubt that that's the case. I want to emphasize here, though, that what I'm talking about mostly is usage of our print collections, and this is in research libraries. I haven't seen any comprehensive studies of what's happening in the comprehensives and the liberal arts institutions, but I suspect that the patterns are a little bit different there. So those are three things that I see continuing to push us in academic libraries in the direction of DDA. So now I'm going to turn it over to David to talk about some inhibiting factors that he sees.
So the first 15 years of my career was in book publishing, and part of that involved launching a Born Digital specialty book publishing company, and then helping a originally print-based company navigate to digital. So I was sort of on the front end of ebooks rolling into PDA, DDA programs, and it was fascinating for me to experience it from the perspective of a publisher, but it became even more fascinating when I came over to Alexander Street and saw what was going on in a business that was built around distributing basically every form of content. And it immediately occurred to me that if there was ever a place where demand-driven could move into multimedia, it was Alexander Street. So I started writing about this for my column in Against the Grain, and Rick and I have gone back and forth on this topic over dinners for years. And I think that, if tomorrow $10 million was to land on my desk and somebody said, start the company you want to start, I think these are the things I would have to overcome, these 3 points I'm going to talk about now, that I would have to overcome in whatever business I put together to take us in the direction of a sort of a universal platform for all content to be delivered to patrons. And the first is there's no platform standard. We have so many platforms, and it seems to me like we have more platforms coming every day. And what's crazy about that, from my perspective, is that in the consumer market, we see generally the opposite. There's always convergence rather quickly around one or two or maybe three platforms. The other problem we have is that our platforms tend to be single content type. So, you know, Alexander Street has a great video PDA platform. Canopy's got a great PDA platform for video as well. And then you see that the eBook Central platform from ProQuest, my company, is ebook centric, and trying to get video in there would be really difficult. So this is another big hurdle. And the third is, at least so far, we don't see any outside player trying to come up with what I would call a supra solution, a platform that anybody could write to or deliver to their content. Something like that, I think, has to happen. Otherwise, we're just going to continue to see a proliferation of platforms that respond to individual media types. So I'm almost convinced that step one is we have to see an outside player who wants to take on this challenge of a universal platform. Second is the lack of negotiable triggers and prices. That, by the way, that Barbasol can, that was an original prop from the first Jurassic Park film, and this person wants to get like $3,000 for it. I don't think they're going to get $3,000 for it. I don't know if you can see it up there, but they were at the very end of their auction on eBay. So why is this a problem, the lack of negotiable triggers and prices? So the librarian, the buyer, the librarian, you have very limited influence on the price being paid, right? The prices and the triggers. You have very limited influence. Similarly, the creators of the content, the publishers, the producers, they have very limited influence on the price or the triggers. And you can't get a mass of content onto a platform where nobody has any control over the pricing except the middleman, right? So this is an issue that's going to have to be addressed. I'm not suggesting that an eBay-like solution is necessarily the absolute right solution where it's sort of a wild west of putting a price up there and letting people bid on it. But some flexibility in setting pricing and negotiating pricing between the purchaser, the librarian, and the producer of the content will have to come into play, or there's going to be lots of players who are not going to put their content in those platforms. They all value it very differently. People think differently about the pricing of a book from print to digital, the pricing of a video file from a DVD to digital, and I'm sure if you were to talk to Scores publishers, they would say the same thing. And the last point I wanted to make is, is that these pricing models, these legacy pricing models, are heavily influencing these price points that are being set. And so people are going to have to let go. So I said that the librarians had limited influence and the publishers had limited influence. There are other players in this, the aggregators and the publishers and producers and distributors, that are going to have to start to let go of pricing assumptions built in legacy models. That's the third point that's going to inhibit us. It has to be overcome, in other words, for us to move towards this universal platform, all content available. So in spite of Rick's third point about what's propelling us, that is decreasing demand for commodity collections, there's still a heck of a lot of collection building going on, and a lot of it is generated through the curation work of our teams at Alexander Street, places like Adam Matthew, that are doing great work to cull through massive amounts of content and pick what is most essential around a topic like borders and migration or 19th century women's diaries. That curation leads to collections that have high value, and that tends to inhibit the movement of that content into this environment, of course. Also, in spite of Rick's comment about the Harlequin romance books, what's being acquired in demand-driven models is still imperfect. People still see acquisition of content that they're like, oh boy, I'm not sure that really fits our core mission to have that piece of content. So that's a struggle that we have to address. Finally, there's the issue of renting versus owning. There are a ton of content providers out there, and it's growing daily, that just do not want to participate in schemes where ownership is critical. And that, of course, is a core mission in university libraries. So we have to address that. And I don't have any easy answer there. You know, we can put content side by side in our platforms where you can own it perpetually or you can only get it on a term subscription. But ultimately, the best scenario is all purchase models available, all content, all in one platform, right? And these are, again, factors I see inhibiting our move in that direction. And with that, we'll open it up to questions. Yeah.
I'm curious on, are you guys familiar with JSTOR's new evidence-based acquisitions model? I'm curious as to your opinion on it. I can give you a brief description of it, at least from a publisher's perspective. Where it's different, it's evidence-based, but they set aside a pool of 25% of whatever the deposit is for proportionally distributing to publishers whose content didn't get used. And I see that as a real positive as a publisher because it does help support some of the less popular disciplines. But I'm curious, for me, that makes a big difference, and it makes it a lot more attractive. Of course, with JSTOR, one of the concerns is sort of what you were discussing, the pricing thing. We don't always have control over, what they're going to charge a consortium or something like that, how deep they'll discount some of our content. But all in all, I kind of like the model. I'm curious from a librarian's perspective, what are your thoughts on it?
Yeah, I know the model exists, but I'm not as familiar with it as I should be. From what you're describing, it does sound like certainly an interesting model. And my mind is generally open. I'm always happy to hear about a new approach, and in most cases, I'm happy to try it out and see what happens. I think that sometimes, and I know that this is something I have to really watch for in myself, is I don't want to get too doctrinaire about what's right and wrong when it comes to purchasing models, right? I want to try to focus on cost and benefit. Am I going to end up spending this money that the university has entrusted me with? Am I going to end up spending as much of it as possible, solving as much problem as possible for my students and faculty? And I'm very aware that a model that I might look at and intuitively go, I don't think that makes much sense to me, might end up doing that really well. And so that leads me to be pretty promiscuous about pilot projects. I'll basically get into bed with anybody who promises me good value for money. Please don't tweet that. But, so we try stuff like that out all the time, and I'm sure that we'll be doing the same with JSTOR, and then just seeing what the outcome is.
The other element of it that's different is it allows 3-year windowing. So it's basically, you can, if you're a publisher, restrict it only to backlists.
Oh, interesting.
So it does sort of address there's adoption potential. After 3 years, I think a publisher will know whether or not there's adoption.
And that actually brings up a point that I intended to raise and I failed to, and that is that many of you in this room may know Richard Fisher, used to be at Cambridge University Press. He sends out email updates to people who are interested on a regular basis, and after the Frankfurt Book Fair, he sent out one just a week or so ago where he was talking about the fact that a lot of publishers are signaling their intention to pull back from DDA programs because they're not selling enough, which I get. What worries me is that if these publishers, and I see the 3-year windowing as a way that a publisher might deal with that. Okay, this is not how I want to sell front list, but this is okay for my backlist. Totally makes sense. Here's the problem though. If publishers pull back from DDA thinking that in response, libraries are going to go back to their old levels of purchasing, they're absolutely kidding themselves. Mm-hmm. Because one of the things, and again, I think I've got to ask, please don't tweet that I'm saying this. Again, one of the things that DDA has done for us is it has exposed how incredibly low the usage of scholarly monographs is in most of our libraries. And in light of that information, which we now cannot unknow, we can't go back to spending what we used to spend, even though we might like to, especially to the degree that our goal is to build a great collection. But if our goal is not to build a great collection, but rather to use a collection as one of multiple tools in meeting the research needs of our students and faculty, then we're not going to go back to that level of spending, and we're going to keep diverting money to the journal content that's still getting really, really strong use. It kills me to say that as a book person, but it's just where we are, I'm afraid. Anything you want to add to that, Dave?
No, I would.
It is on. Are you guys hearing?
You can hear us pretty well anyway, right? Yeah. We're both loudmouths, right?
Yeah.
The only thing I would add real quickly is that I think that this gets to the heart of negotiated pricing. And I know, again, that sounds like an eBay free-for-all, but if you've got a scholar on campus who needs the most current monograph on any given topic, that one use might have a really high value, much higher than what's being presented right now, or it might have a much lower value. But allowing some negotiation in setting that price through the presentation of information, demand, what is the context of demand, you might be able to address the problem in a way that publishers would find acceptable.
I read an article years ago, a magazine article by some guy who was arguing that every price is negotiable. He said it's just that we don't bother to negotiate. Yeah. He said, but I go to the grocery store and I say, I'll give you $3 for these pineapples. And he said, most of the time they look at you kind of funny, but sometimes they go, all right. I can't live my life that way, right? But I have often thought, what if a sales rep from a journal publisher came to my library and said, here's a journal that you can have for $10,000 a year. What if I were to say, I'll give you $100 for it a year? Now it's your turn. What would happen? It's not like negotiating a salary where you're running the risk that they just won't hire you because you're a freak. No publisher is going to say, $100, never mind, I'm not willing to sell to you. You always have the option of going, say, okay, $10,000, fine. But especially in a marketplace where list prices are not always, there isn't always a list price. You call up a publisher, say, how much is this journal? They say, well, tell me more about your institution. In a context like that, everything is negotiable. And I don't think we exercise. As librarians, I think we tend to be too timid. Our profession has not historically self-selected for aggressive price negotiation. Not price negotiators, I think. I hope that's not unfair to say.
Jonathan Harwell, Rollins College. Glad to see this conversation continuing. We bring up things like this at Charleston from time to time, alternative demand-driven models for serial content, book chapters, audiovisuals. My question is whether ProQuest or any other vendors represented here are actually prepared to push this forward and make this happen. What are you working on?
So I should have said at the beginning, the opinions expressed today are not those of ProQuest or Alexander Street. They're the opinions of Rick Anderson. No, I'm kidding.
I wrote David's slides for him.
Yeah, no, I'm kidding. Speaking for myself and for my involvement pan or across ProQuest and across Alexander Street, there are conversations underway about how we can bring ebooks and video together in a demand-driven model. But again, we're inhibited, just like everyone else is, by the platforms. We've constructed platforms that are uni-content. Is that a word?
You bet.
Yeah, okay, I made it up. That are amenable to one content form. That's what I mean, right? So they don't easily lend themselves to multiple content forms. Plus, we've established pricing trigger mechanisms that are aligned real simply or to one content type and one pricing medium. So they don't necessarily easily lend themselves. In other words, the pricing and trigger mechanisms you have in ebooks are really different from what they are for video. And the underlying architecture and the platforms require a whole lot of work to make that, to address that as an issue. So, to what extent are aggregators, publishers working on this problem? I can speak only for my company and say that we are thinking hard about how we get video and ebooks together. And that's about as far as we've gone.
Hi, I'm Julia Gelfand from the University of California at Irvine. I agree with Rick that we're seeing our usage decline.
And our microphone.
You got the booby trap microphone.
Many formats, but what I am curious about is why libraries have been unable to influence publishers to tell us when they're going to release what in all formats at we've developed them today. I don't have enough information to make intelligent decisions, and I'm finding that that's hampering my ability to budget accordingly, to set priorities, and to do other things that good business models require and dictate for long-range planning. So I think publishers, I've been harping on this for a long time, really need to say you're signing rights agreements with authors for everything under the sun, and why can't you share that and put it in our plans, and we can determine whether we want it on approval, whether I want it in print and on what platform I want it, and if libraries are really there to dictate that they want it in a pristine format, we don't want it from aggregators any longer. But it has simplified our procedures and reduced the number of interventions, that we've done that. But we're seeing so many platforms and so many models, and we're trying to do it with reduced manpower. So, I mean, we're caught in this dilemma of not making a sustainable decision or building sustainable collections. And this is sort of wondering from the publisher's perspective, why is this so difficult to achieve?
Is there anybody here from a book publisher that would like to respond to that? That mic needs to be connected to the cord in order to...
I think they don't do it because it's not sustainable. I mean, they need to maximize revenue. And if I tell you all of my plans, you're going to reduce my revenue significantly. It's a market-based system. If it weren't a market-based system, yeah, sure, I'd love to give you all that information and give you all the choice in the world, but I've got to survive on revenue, and
We're just not buying, so that's the bottom line.
So I think in particular, like the question of hardback and paperback simultaneous publication, I think it's probably fair to say that a publisher who puts out the hardback without saying for certain whether it's planning to put out the paperback is doing two things. One of them, trying to sell as many hardbacks as possible because you make more money on those. And second of all, trying to determine whether or not a paper edition is actually worth doing, which you can't see until you see what the hardback sales levels are. So it's hard.
Kind of follow briefly, just mention also that the ebook version from eBrary and EBSCO sometimes sit in the not yet published category for 3 or 4 years.
Yeah, that's really frustrating.
So I can tell you from, and I'll be real quick. I can tell you from my years, I worked at Pearson. I worked at Pearson Education. I was editor-in-chief for the business publishing group there. Then I started my own company, Business Expert Press, and I managed an engineering imprint called Momentum Press before I came to Alexander Street. And I can tell you that there is an element of fear and what might happen, fears of cannibalization of sales, fears of what might happen if we do this. And at some publishers, that runs at higher levels and mitigates their willingness to play with other models, other distribution schemes, other policies about putting everything into every platform. At other publishers where the fear threshold is lower, they will play around more with those models. And I'll stay away from naming specific companies, but I think you know when you're dealing with publishers that are more amenable to more models, more forward distribution policies. Last point, on video distribution, we found as a medium that we're better off putting it into all of our product distribution models as soon as we publish it. It's just easier for us.
And I was going to say, I work for Duke University Press, and we publish the paperback and hardcover simultaneously. We've actually now found that it's protecting our revenue stream. So as the library budget straight, we have the visual market is buying our paperback, so it's sort of offsetting that.
Daniel, go ahead. All right.
So, yeah, my question's for Dave. So your two hindering things. So on the first one, and I've always kind of wondered, I mean, I look at the big STM publisher, I look at the large publishers and I think, wow, they're huge, but really we're in a much bigger ecosystem, and there's tech companies that would make them, look relatively small in comparison. And so you have this point about there's outside players. If an outside player stepped in, how would that disrupt, how would that change the environment? But then your last hindrance, the thing about, you've got these companies that are creating these collections, like Alexander Street Press, and they have value. And so you wouldn't necessarily want to go to that kind of platform. And then there's also copyright, so authors are signing away their rights. So I'm just wondering, I guess it's hindrance upon hindrance, but if there was a tech player to step in, how would you see that sort of in a maybe sort of theoretical way, really changing the dynamics of the current model or current environment?
Yeah, I think about that a lot. How many of you know who Chris Warnock is? He's the founder of eBrary.
And a University of Utah graduate.
So he's one of the smartest people I know, and about a year or so ago, I said to Chris, because now, he sold eBrary and he's on his yacht or his boat and whatever he's doing. Well, he's doing a lot of thinking, actually. He's involved in a lot of interesting enterprises. And I said to him, why doesn't a platform emerge? A single, unified platform from an external tech player that everybody writes to. And he said, how do you know it won't? And I said, what are you telling me, Chris? Do you know something I don't know? And he said, no, I don't. He said, but it does seem inevitable as more media types become more central to the education and scholarly experience on campus, and more publishers of that content decide that they have to make it available digitally, that inevitably somebody will see the size of a business opportunity that makes it appealing for them. That's his perspective. I don't know if it's right or it's wrong, but I can tell you, working at Alexander Street, where every day we talk to archives, scores publishers, music publishers, video publishers, book publishers, only a sliver of those folks are making their content available digitally and in single title distribution models. So at some point, the floodgate is going to open, and I believe somebody, whether it's within our own sphere or outside of our sphere, will figure out how to create something universal.
And the only thing I would add is that I suspect that that's true, but I don't think it will happen until somebody figures out how to make money doing it. And this may sound really obvious, but I feel like in libraries, because we're mission-driven, we have a tendency to think in terms of mission, and we think, well, something is inevitable because it's clearly needed. Things that are clearly needed are not inevitable. There's tons of things that we need that we don't have and may never have. They don't become inevitable until the idea becomes economically viable. When it becomes economically viable, then the inevitable thing actually happens. So to me, the question with the universal platform idea is, as David said, at what point does somebody with resources go, there's an amazing business opportunity? That may not be the way we would like it to be, but I think that that's probably the way it is.
I 100% agree, and then I'll shut up. Sorry, and that's the issue of scale, right? When enough content types and enough volume of content is available digitally with flexibility around delivering it in single title model, then you've got the business opportunity.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Lisa, are you going to?
Yeah, and I was not to go from Wiley, and I think there's an interesting balance there. I think it's good to bring up the idea of the mission aspect of what we will do here, because there are those large aggregated solutions out there for things like books and warmongers called Amazon. And that proposition has really changed the economics for publishers. And it used to look great, and not so much anymore. So the economics of the idea of a consolidation of all content and all content types, when what we're all really concerned about is protecting the intellectual property of our authors, becomes a real challenge.
I think we have to close, though, because...
So,
yeah, so Lisa gets the last word, as always.
Thank you, everybody.